Breaking tonight. And this is not exaggeration, not speculation, and not internet noise. The President of the United States has just publicly threatened to seize territory from a NATO ally. Not an adversary. Not a hostile state. An ally. And if you think this has nothing to do with Canada, you are dangerously underestimating what just happened and where the Arctic map places us next. Here is the sequence that should alarm every Canadian policymaker. Yesterday in Washington, Vice President J.D. Vance and Secretary of State Marco Rubio met with Denmark's Foreign Minister and a representative of Greenland. On paper, it looked like a routine diplomatic engagement. The kind of meeting that happens quietly, ends with a bland communiqué, and disappears from the news cycle. Except hours before that meeting, Donald Trump posted something that shattered a core assumption of the post-war alliance system. He demanded that NATO should assist the United States in acquiring Greenland, and declared that anything less would be unacceptable. Read that again carefully. The sitting American president demanded that a military alliance help him take territory from one of its own members. This was not a joke. This was not satire. This was not off-the-cuff rhetoric. This was a direct challenge to the idea that alliances protect sovereignty rather than erase it. For decades, Western security rested on one unspoken rule. Borders between allies were not up for negotiation. That rule just died in a social media post. And Canada shares an Arctic frontier with the country now being threatened. European analysts initially dismissed Trump's Greenland comments as negotiating theater. Canadian observers assumed the 1951 defense agreement protecting Denmark's sovereignty would hold. Some even believed NATO's institutional inertia would prevent anything serious from happening. They were catastrophically wrong. What unfolded between January 13th and January 15th, 2026 was not diplomacy as usual. It was a stress test of whether alliances still function when power turns predatory. On January 13th, Trump doubled down. He declared that the United States needs Greenland for national security. He invoked Russian and Chinese ships as justification. He claimed NATO would become far more formidable if Greenland were placed under American control. Notice the language. Not cooperation. Not shared defense. Control. Possession. Ownership. This was not a request. It was a demand framed as inevitability. Denmark understood the danger immediately. On January 14th, Copenhagen announced an immediate expansion of military presence around Greenland. Not after consultations, not after summits, immediately. And critically, Denmark made one thing clear. Other NATO allies would be joining that deployment. This was not symbolic. It was deterrence. Denmark responded to American pressure by internationalizing Greenland's defense, ensuring that any move against the island would trigger consequences far beyond a bilateral dispute. Then came the public resistance. Greenland's representatives broke diplomatic protocol and asked Trump a question that cut through everything. Why don't you ask us? They reminded the world that polling shows virtually no support among Greenlanders for becoming American. They asserted sovereignty publicly. They aligned themselves with Denmark and NATO, not Washington. In less than 72 hours, Denmark executed a coordinated strategy that turned American aggression into a liability. Military reinforcement, alliance unity, public legitimacy, political tripwires. And suddenly, acquisition became impossible without triggering Article 5 and fracturing NATO itself. This is the moment Canada must study carefully. Because if the United States can openly threaten Greenland, a NATO ally, the question is no longer hypothetical. What stops similar demands over Canadian Arctic territory? Over the Northwest Passage? Over mineral-rich zones we have barely mapped? Trump's justification makes this even more dangerous. He claims security threats justify territorial control. But locals in Greenland say Russian and Chinese ships are largely absent. Even Greenlandic officials have called the security argument a cover. The real motivation is resources. Greenland holds vast reserves of rare earth elements, critical to batteries, electronics, military systems, and future industrial dominance. As Arctic ice melts, extraction becomes viable, shipping routes open, strategic value explodes. Now look north from Canada. We sit on similar deposits, similar routes, similar vulnerabilities. And the American president just normalized the idea that Allied territory is negotiable if it contains resources Washington wants. This is not about Greenland alone. This is about a precedent, and Canada is directly in its path. In the next part, we'll examine how Denmark's response worked, why it succeeded so quickly, and why Canada's current posture leaves us exposed if we don't adapt fast. Because the Arctic is no longer a frozen buffer, it is the next geopolitical fault line. To understand why Denmark's response worked and why Canada must adapt immediately, you have to understand what Copenhagen did differently from almost every country that has faced pressure from Washington in the past. Denmark did not argue. Denmark did not plead. Denmark did not wait. Denmark acted. Within hours of Trump's threat, Copenhagen announced an expanded military presence around Greenland. No committees, no ongoing discussions, no language about de-escalation, just action, and not alone. The most important detail was almost buried in the announcement. Other NATO allies were joining the deployment. That single move changed the entire equation. Because once multiple Allied forces are present on Greenland, any attempt by the United States to acquire the territory is no longer a bilateral issue. It becomes a confrontation with the alliance itself. It triggers Article 5 dynamics, whether Washington likes it or not. And suddenly, Trump's threat is no longer a show of strength. It has a potential alliance-ending crisis. This is multilateral deterrence executed at speed, and it worked. While Trump framed his demand as national security, Denmark reframed the situation as alliance integrity. They made it clear that Greenland was not an object to be negotiated, but a sovereign territory embedded inside collective defense structures. Then, Denmark layered pressure. France immediately condemned Trump's language as blackmail. Within days, Paris announced it would open a consulate in Greenland. Canada followed with similar plans. These were not symbolic gestures. Consulates create legal presence, diplomatic stakes, and political consequences. Every new flag planted in Greenland made American action more costly. Denmark also mobilized the one constraint Trump cannot fully control: Congress. On January 15th, bipartisan U.S. senators introduced legislation prohibiting the use of defense or State Department funds to annex or control Greenland or any NATO territory without consent. Republican Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska joined Democrat Jeanne Shaheen of New Hampshire. That detail matters. When lawmakers from Trump's own party moved to block his authority, it signals that even within Washington, this threat crossed a line. It also reveals something Canada must not ignore. Those guardrails are political, not permanent. If Trump consolidates power, or if institutional resistance weakens, congressional constraints can disappear, which means Canada cannot rely on American restraint as a strategy. Now compare Denmark's response to Canada's current posture. When Trump jokes about Canada becoming the 51st state, Ottawa issues careful statements about partnership. When he threatens trade retaliation, we consult. When he tests rhetorical boundaries, we downplay. Denmark did the opposite. They made the cost of escalation immediate and unbearable. They did not ask Washington to behave better. They engineered a situation where Washington could not act without detonating its own alliances. That's the lesson. Because this is not an isolated incident. Trump has now openly threatened Greenland. He has talked about reclaiming the Panama Canal. He has repeatedly framed Canada as a subordinate rather than a partner. Every target shares the same profile: strategically valuable territory, resources America wants, and a belief that pressure will succeed. The Arctic magnifies this risk. Ice is melting faster than predicted. The Northwest Passage will be commercially viable far sooner than previously expected. Rare earths, energy reserves, and shipping routes are becoming accessible in real time. And Trump has just demonstrated that Allied sovereignty does not automatically protect you when resources are at stake. Canada has three choices. The first is denial, hoping the next administration restores norms. That is not a policy. That is wishful thinking. The second is bilateral negotiation, trying to manage American demands quietly, trading access for stability. That is how sovereignty erodes without a headline. The third is the Denmark model. Expand Arctic presence immediately. Embed Canadian sovereignty inside multilateral structures. Make any move against Canadian territory an attack on multiple allied interests simultaneously. This means more than patrols. It means joint deployments, shared infrastructure, allied investment, multinational stakes in Arctic projects that transform Canadian sovereignty into a collective interest. Because deterrence does not come from strength alone. It comes from entanglement. Denmark understood that. They didn't rely on goodwill. They relied on cost. Canada must do the same, before pressure turns into precedent. In the final part, we'll look at what this means specifically for the Northwest Passage, Arctic minerals, and why the window to act is closing faster than most Canadians realize. Now, we need to talk about what all of this means for Canada, because Greenland is not an isolated case. It is a warning shot. The Arctic is no longer a distant frontier. It is becoming the central arena of 21st century power. Shipping routes, critical minerals, energy corridors, military early warning systems. Whoever controls the Arctic controls leverage over global trade and security. And Canada sits at the center of it. The Northwest Passage is the real prize, not in theory, in practice. Ice coverage has declined faster than even aggressive climate models predicted. Seasonal commercial transit is already happening. Year-round viability is no longer a question of if, but when. The United States has never fully recognized Canadian sovereignty over the passage. Washington frames it as an international strait. Ottawa insists it is internal waters. That legal disagreement has been manageable for decades because the ice made the argument academic. That era is ending. Trump's Greenland threat changes the calculus completely. It establishes a new precedent. Territory can be claimed if framed as national security. Resources justify control. Alliances are optional when interests collide. If Greenland is necessary for U.S. security, why not Arctic transit routes? If rare earths justify pressure on Denmark, why not Canadian mineral deposits? If NATO can be invoked to take territory, what stops the same logic from being applied north of our provinces? This is why Denmark's response matters so much for Canada. They didn't wait for negotiations to fail. They didn't assume institutions would hold. They moved before the situation hardened into a new normal. Canada must do the same. The Northwest Passage needs to be internationalized on Canadian terms, not American ones. That means multilateral transit frameworks with European and Asian allies that explicitly recognize Canadian sovereignty while allowing regulated access. The goal is simple. Make Canadian control legally boring and politically non-negotiable. Our critical mineral deposits must follow the same logic. Joint development partnerships with Japan, South Korea, and the EU embed foreign interests inside Canadian territory. When multiple allies depend on Canadian supply chains, any attempt to coerce Canada becomes a fight with more than one capital. This is exactly what Denmark did with Greenland. And it worked. Arctic defense must evolve as well. Patrols are not enough. Presence matters, but shared presence matters more. Joint NATO deployments, integrated radar systems, shared logistics hubs. Every allied boot, antenna, and vessel in the Canadian Arctic raises the cost of interference. This is not about militarization. It is about deterrence through visibility. Trump's approach thrives on ambiguity, on the assumption that pressure will be met with hesitation. Denmark shattered that assumption in 72 hours. Canada cannot afford delay, because institutional resistance inside the United States is weakening. Congressional constraints exist today, but they are political tools, not permanent safeguards. If power consolidates further in the White House, those breaks can vanish overnight. The time to lock in Canada's Arctic position is now, while multilateral frameworks still matter, and allies are alert. This is not anti-American. It is reality-based sovereignty. Denmark didn't choose between the United States and NATO. They chose to bind NATO to Greenland so tightly that Washington had no room to maneuver. Canada must do the same across the Arctic. What we are witnessing is not the collapse of the rules-based order caused by distant autocracies. It is erosion from the center, from the very power that once enforced the rules. Countries that survive this shift are not the loudest. They are the fastest, the most embedded, and the least dependent on goodwill. Denmark understood that instinctively. Canada must internalize it urgently, because when the ice melts completely, the arguments will stop being theoretical, and the countries that acted early will still control their territory. The Arctic has entered its decisive phase. Canada's window to act is closing, and sovereignty, once tested, is never tested gently.